maintenance worker in a faded gray uniform stood quietly at the edge of the boardroom, holding a small tablet nobody had asked him to touch. And he said only one sentence into the tense silence of the room. If this $1 error is not corrected before the signatures are placed, the company will lose more than $1 billion. For a moment, nobody moved, and then laughter rolled across the polished table like a wave nobody could stop. Victoria Sinclair, the chief executive officer of Helix Dynamics, did not even lift her eyes from the documents in front of her. She tossed the folder onto the table with a sharp, dismissive motion and told him to go fix his light bulb and leave finance to people with real qualifications. 10 minutes later, Ethan Carter was escorted out of the building he no longer worked for. 2 hours after that, in front of hundreds of investors watching remotely and dozens more seated in the room, the $1.2 billion deal collapsed in real time on every screen in the building. Nobody in that room would forget the sentence the fired maintenance man had left behind before he walked out into the gray Chicago rain. The smallest error, he had said, always destroys the largest deal. Nobody had listened to him, and by evening, everybody was repeating it. By the following morning, the story had already reached every floor of the building, whispered between assistants, repeated in elevators, softened and sharpened again as it passed from one department to another, until almost nobody could agree on exactly what had been said in that boardroom. Only that a man in a uniform had been right, and a woman in a corner office had been wrong. Some called it luck. Some called it an omen. Nobody yet understood how deep the truth actually ran, or how far back it stretched into a life that had ended, quietly and completely, 10 years earlier. Helix Dynamics occupied 42 floors of glass and steel in downtown Chicago, a company that had built its reputation on merging advanced manufacturing systems with predictive financial technology, and on that particular autumn morning, with a light drizzle streaking the windows, the entire building pulsed with an energy that bordered on reverence. Today was the day the company would sign the largest acquisition partnership in its 20-year history, a $1.2 billion deal with a private equity group that would triple the company's manufacturing capacity across 3 continents. Executives had been preparing for 6 months. Analysts had modeled every possible outcome. Investors had flown in from New York, from London, from Singapore, and the building's top floor, the executive floor, had been polished and staged like a stage set for a performance that could not afford a single mistake. Victoria Sinclair arrived that morning, the way she arrived every morning, with an entourage of assistants trailing behind her heels, a tablet already glowing in her hand, and an expression that suggested she had already won before the meeting had even begun. She was 38 years old, the youngest chief executive officer in the company's history, a woman who had clawed her way from a junior analyst position to the top office through sheer intelligence and an unforgiving belief that data was the only truth worth trusting. She did not trust instinct. She did not trust experience that could not be quantified. She trusted numbers on a screen, and on that morning, the numbers on her screen told her that everything was ready. Meanwhile, in a service corridor 2 floors below, a man in a maintenance uniform knelt beside an air conditioning unit that had been malfunctioning for 3 days, a man nobody on the executive floor recognized by name, a man whose badge simply read facilities. Ethan Carter was 39 years old, quiet in a way that made people forget he was in the room, and he moved through the building with the kind of careful attention that came from a life that had once demanded far more of him than replacing a faulty sensor. He had been a systems engineer once, and before that, a specialist in supply chain optimization, whose name had appeared on patents that companies far larger than Helix still used every single day. But that life belonged to someone else now, a man who no longer existed, a man Ethan had buried along with his wife after the accident that had quietly ended everything he used to be. As he adjusted the sensor wiring near the ceiling, his eyes drifted, almost by accident, to a financial dashboard glowing on a nearby monitor that the analysts had left running overnight, streams of numbers scrolling past in the cold blue light of the corridor. He was not looking for anything. He had no reason to look, but something in the pattern caught his attention the way a wrong note catches the ear of a musician who has spent a lifetime listening for exactly that kind of error, and he leaned closer, forgetting the sensor entirely. Buried inside a valuation column that fed directly into the automated pricing algorithm was a single entry. One line among thousands, where a cost figure had been entered incorrectly by exactly $1, not $1 million, not $1,000, precisely $1. A discrepancy so microscopic that no human auditor would ever flag it. So small that any ordinary accountant would have dismissed it without a second thought. But Ethan was not looking at it as an ordinary accountant would. Because 10 years earlier, in a different life, under a different name and a different title, he had built the very algorithm that was now processing that number. He set down his tools slowly, forgetting entirely about the sensor he had come to repair, and traced the number backward through the visible parts of the model, the way a man might trace a crack running through a wall, back to the exact point where the foundation had first shifted. It was the kind of detail that revealed itself only to someone who had once written every line of the logic himself. Someone who understood not merely what the numbers said, but why the system had been built to react the way it did. For a brief moment, he considered that perhaps he was wrong, that 10 years away from the work had dulled his certainty. But the longer he stared at the screen, the more convinced he became that the small error in front of him was about to become very large indeed. He knew, the way only its original architect could know, that this particular valuation model used a nonlinear pricing structure, one where the smallest input at a specific threshold could redirect the entire calculation down an entirely different branch of logic. A $1 error in an ordinary spreadsheet would remain a $1 error. But inside this algorithm, at this specific point in the model, that single dollar would trigger the automated risk engine used by the investment fund to flag the entire valuation as internally inconsistent. An error category serious enough to halt any deal before signatures were exchanged. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the screen, weighing what he already suspected would happen if he said nothing at all. He thought about walking away. He genuinely considered it, because he had spent years building a life that asked nothing of him beyond fixing broken things that could not fight back or dismiss him, a life deliberately smaller than the one he used to lead. But he also thought about the thousands of employees on the lower floors who had no idea their jobs depended on a number nobody else could see. And that thought settled something in him that quiet detachment could not undo. He picked up his tablet, walked toward the elevator, and asked the front desk assistant if he could have 5 minutes with someone from the finance department before the signing began. The assistant looked at his uniform, then at the clock, then back at his uniform again, and told him, not unkindly, that nobody in finance had 5 minutes to spare that morning. Ethan asked if a message could at least be passed along, and the assistant, more out of politeness than expectation, agreed to mention it to someone if the opportunity arose. He did not push further. He had learned, in the years since his old life ended, that pushing rarely changed anything, and instead he simply waited near the corridor, hoping someone would eventually walk past who might listen. It was Victoria who happened to overhear the exchange, stepping out of a side office with her assistant in tow. Catching only the tail end of the conversation, and something about the phrase "before the signing begins" made her stop mid-stride. She turned toward Ethan with the particular sharpness she reserved for anything that threatened to disrupt a schedule she had spent 6 months perfecting. A maintenance employee, she said, wanted to discuss finance with her on the morning of the largest deal in company history. Several nearby staff members laughed, not maliciously, but the kind of reflexive laughter that comes from disbelief. And Victoria folded her arms and told him he had exactly 1 minute. Ethan did not flinch at the laughter, nor did he rush his words to fit inside the minute she had allotted him. He explained, calmly and precisely, that there was a single dollar discrepancy inside the valuation feed, that the nonlinear structure of the pricing algorithm would treat that discrepancy as a structural inconsistency rather than a rounding error, and that the automated risk engine used by the investment fund would very likely flag the entire model before the deal could close. He offered to show her exactly where the number lived and exactly why it mattered, speaking the way a man speaks when he has already lived through the consequences of being ignored once before. He kept his tablet lowered at his side rather than holding it up as proof, aware that pushing evidence toward her would only make him look more desperate to be believed than confident in what he already knew, and instead he simply described, step by step, the exact chain of calculations the discrepancy would travel through before reaching the fund's review software. Marcus Reed, standing near the back of the small crowd that had gathered, felt something uneasy stir in his chest at the mention of the risk engine, a system his own department relied on constantly but understood only at the surface. He opened his mouth once, as though considering whether to ask a clarifying question of his own, but a glance at Victoria's expression convinced him it was safer to stay quiet. Victoria did not let him finish. She had heard enough phrases like nonlinear structure and automated risk engine to assume he was simply repeating jargon he did not understand, the kind of language ambitious junior employees sometimes borrowed to sound smarter than their position allowed. She assumed, without asking, that this was an attempt to be noticed, perhaps even a strange kind of manipulation. And she cut him off before he could explain the mechanism any further. "Fix your $1 mistake and leave," she told him, loud enough for the surrounding staff to hear. And then, after a pause that seemed to enjoy its own cruelty, she added that he should actually leave permanently. Within 10 minutes, security had escorted Ethan Carter out of a building where, unbeknownst to every person watching, he was the only human being alive who fully understood the system about to fail. Ethan did not argue on his way out. He did not ask for a hearing, did not request a manager, did not raise his voice even once, and the calm with which he accepted his own dismissal unsettled the two guards walking beside him far more than any protest would have. He handed over his access badge at the front security desk without being asked twice, buttoned his jacket against the drizzle outside, and stepped into the gray Chicago morning as though he had expected this outcome long before it arrived. Somewhere behind him, the celebration for the signing ceremony was already being arranged. Champagne glasses lined up on a side table nobody would ever get to use that day. What none of the executives standing in that boardroom knew, and what even Ethan rarely spoke about anymore, was that 10 years earlier, he had been the lead architect behind the very pricing algorithm Helix Dynamics still relied on for every major valuation. Back then, he had carried a different title, led a different team, and built a career that seemed destined for the very executive floor he had just been thrown off of. But after the accident that took his wife's life, a slow unraveling that few colleagues ever witnessed up close, he had quietly sold the patent rights to his algorithm, resigned from every position he held, and disappeared from the industry entirely, choosing anonymity the way other men chose to disappear into distant cities. Nobody currently sitting in Helix leadership had any memory of his name, because by the time Victoria became chief executive officer, Ethan Carter had already become nobody, at least on paper. In the years that followed his wife's death, Ethan had turned down 3 separate offers from competing firms, each one promising a larger salary and a grander title than the last, and each one he refused without explanation because no amount of money could answer the question that kept him awake at night. The question of what exactly he had been building toward in the first place. He had once believed that success meant climbing until the climbing itself justified the cost, but grief had rearranged that belief entirely, leaving him with a quieter ambition, one that asked only for peace and predictability, the kind a maintenance badge could offer that a corner office never had. He took the position at Helix under a name that meant nothing to anyone, repaired broken machines instead of broken markets, and told himself, most days, that this smaller life was enough. Olivia Bennett, the company's chief operating officer, had been the only person in that boardroom who paused after Ethan's dismissal, something about his calm certainty nagging at her long after the laughter had faded. She had worked at Helix for nearly 12 years, long enough to remember a period before the current pricing algorithm existed, and long enough to sense, in some instinctive way she could not immediately explain, that Ethan's confidence had not looked like the confidence of a man bluffing his way through unfamiliar territory. Once the signing ceremony resumed and attention shifted elsewhere, she quietly excused herself and made her way to the archive floor, a place few executives ever bothered to visit anymore. She requested the original engineering files behind the company's valuation software, documents that had not been opened in years, their digital records buried under a decade of updates and rebranding. It took her nearly 20 minutes of searching before she found the original patent filing, the one that had been quietly licensed to Helix long before Victoria's arrival. And there, listed as the sole architect of the algorithm, was a name she did not expect to see: Ethan Carter. She sat there in the dim archive room for a long moment, staring at the name, feeling something cold settle in her stomach as she realized exactly what the company might have just thrown away. Back on the executive floor, the signing ceremony proceeded exactly as scheduled. Investors seated around a long glass table with Daniel Brooks, chairman of the investment fund, at its head, reviewing the final documents before the formal exchange of signatures. Daniel was a careful man, methodical in a way that had made his fund one of the most trusted names in private equity, and before any signature touched paper, he always ran one final verification through his own firm's automated risk analysis system, a formality that had never once produced a meaningful result in the 11 years he had used it. He nodded to his analyst to begin the final scan, expecting nothing more than a routine green light. The screen at the head of the table blinked once, then displayed a warning banner in sharp red lettering that read, "Inconsistent valuation detected," a message none of the investors had ever seen appear on that particular software before. Marcus Reed, the chief financial officer of Helix Dynamics, felt the color drain from his face as he leaned forward to read the warning a second time, hoping it might resolve itself into something less alarming. Victoria remained composed, telling the room this was almost certainly a software glitch, the kind of harmless error that occasionally appeared in automated systems and disappeared just as quickly upon a second review. She asked her team to rerun the analysis, confident the warning would vanish. It did not vanish. Instead, as Marcus and his team dug deeper into the flagged inconsistency, they uncovered additional irregularities, cascading outward from the original discrepancy, small numerical fractures that had been quietly compounding across multiple valuation layers for months without anyone noticing. The more Victoria attempted to explain away the anomaly, the more the explanation exposed new inconsistencies beneath it, until Daniel Brooks finally raised a hand and asked, in a tone far more serious than before, whether Helix's finance team could actually account for every number in the model they were about to sign. Victoria opened her mouth to answer, and found, for the first time in years, that she had no answer ready. Daniel requested a pause on the signing, a request that fell over the room like a sudden drop in temperature, and every investor at that table understood exactly what a pause of this kind usually meant. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Somewhere outside the boardroom windows, the drizzle had turned into steady rain, streaking down the glass in thin silver lines, as though the city itself understood that something inside that room had just quietly broken beyond an easy repair. Victoria stood at the head of the table, staring at a screen full of numbers she had trusted completely only an hour earlier, and for the first time in her career as chief executive officer, she felt the ground shift beneath a decision she could not undo. The company's most senior financial analysts were pulled from every other project and locked into a conference room for what would become more than 2 hours of frantic recalculation. Spreadsheets opened across a dozen monitors as they traced the anomaly back through layer after layer of the valuation model. They cross-referenced every entry against the original ledgers, rebuilt portions of the algorithm from scratch just to test their assumptions, and argued quietly among themselves about where exactly the fracture had originated. Coffee cups piled up untouched near the door as the hours passed. And more than once, someone suggested the warning might simply be a glitch in the fund's own software, a theory that collapsed each time they reran the numbers and received the identical result. When the answer finally surfaced, it arrived not as a complicated explanation but as something almost embarrassingly simple. A single line item where a cost figure had been entered incorrectly by precisely $1, buried so deep in the model that no ordinary review process would ever have caught it. One of the younger analysts, staring at the number on her screen, said quietly that it seemed almost impossible for something so small to matter this much, and nobody in the room had an answer that made the feeling any easier to sit with. The realization spread through the team slowly, the way bad news often does, each person needing a moment alone with the number before they could bring themselves to report it upward. On its own, A discrepancy of $1 would never have concerned anyone in that room. An amount so small, it barely registered as a rounding error in a company managing billions. But because of the non-linear structure Ethan had once designed specifically to catch subtle irregularities before they compounded into larger risks, that single dollar had pushed the entire valuation model across an internal threshold, causing the automated engine to treat the whole calculation as structurally unreliable. The investment fund's risk software, built to protect exactly this kind of catastrophic blind spot, had done precisely what it was designed to do. And in doing so, had stripped the entire valuation of the credibility it needed to close. Word of the finding reached Daniel Brooks within minutes, and his decision came just as quickly. The investment fund would not proceed with a deal built on a valuation model that had just failed its own integrity check, regardless of how small the underlying cause appeared on paper, because trust in a financial model depended on more than the size of the error. It depended on whether the model could be trusted at all. Word spread through the trading floor before the boardroom had even finished clearing. And, by mid-afternoon, Helix Dynamics' stock price had dropped sharply, wiping out gains investors had spent months anticipating from a deal that no longer existed. Victoria stood alone near the boardroom windows long after the investors had left, watching the rain fall over a city that had, only hours earlier, seemed entirely within her control. And in the silence of that empty room, one sentence kept circling back through her mind uninvited. The smallest error always destroys the largest deal. She had heard those words that very morning from a man in a maintenance uniform. A man she had mocked in front of an entire room. A man she had thrown out of her building without a second thought. And now, standing amid the wreckage of everything she had built her reputation on, she finally understood exactly what he had been trying to tell her. Something inside Victoria Sinclair shifted in that quiet, rain-streaked room, a feeling she did not immediately recognize because she had rarely allowed herself to feel it before. It was not simply embarrassment over a failed deal, and it was not merely frustration at a financial loss that would take months to recover from. It was something closer to shame, an unfamiliar weight settling behind her ribs as she replayed the image of a man trying calmly to warn her while she laughed him out of the room. She picked up her phone and asked her assistant to locate Ethan Carter immediately, though she barely knew, in that moment, what she intended to say to him. Human Resources attempted to reach Ethan through the phone number on file, but the calls went unanswered, and a message left with no return call only deepened the unease spreading through the executive floor. Olivia Bennett, still holding the archived patent documents she had discovered earlier that day, volunteered to go find him in person, sensing that whatever needed to be said could not be delivered through a voicemail. She left the office without waiting for approval, driving through the same steady rain that had been falling since morning, following an old employment address that led her not to an apartment building, but to a small, unremarkable repair shop on the edge of the city. The drive took nearly 40 minutes, longer than she expected, the city thinning out into quieter neighborhoods where the buildings grew shorter and the streets grew narrower. And somewhere along the way, Olivia found herself questioning the version of the morning she had witnessed, replaying the laughter in that boardroom, and wondering how many other warnings, over how many other years, had been dismissed just as easily because they arrived in the wrong uniform. She had worked at Helix long enough to have seen good ideas buried under bad assumptions before, though never one quite this expensive, and never one she had failed to speak up against herself. By the time she pulled up outside the small shop with its flickering sign and rain-streaked windows, she had already decided that whatever Ethan chose to do next, she owed him at least an honest conversation. Inside, she found Ethan exactly where she somehow expected to find him, sleeves rolled up, hands steady, repairing the engine of an old delivery van as though the events of that morning belonged to someone else entirely. He looked up when she entered, recognized her instantly, and offered a small, unbothered nod before returning his attention to the engine in front of him. Olivia stood there for a moment, unsure how to begin, before finally telling him that the deal had collapsed exactly the way he had predicted, and that the entire company was now searching for him because of it. Ethan wiped his hands on a cloth and said simply that he was no longer an employee of Helix Dynamics, and that whatever had happened after his dismissal was no longer his responsibility to fix. Olivia did not leave immediately, because something about his calm refusal only strengthened her suspicion that there was far more to this man than a job title on a badge. And she asked him gently, almost carefully, how he had known so precisely what the algorithm would do. Ethan paused, set down his tools, and looked at her for a long moment before answering that he had built the algorithm himself, a decade earlier, under circumstances he did not particularly enjoy discussing. Olivia felt something settle into place then, the archived documents she had found earlier, suddenly making complete sense, and she asked if he would be willing to at least speak with Victoria directly, if only to explain what the company now desperately needed to understand. Ethan considered the request in silence, weighing the memory of being publicly humiliated against the knowledge that thousands of employees who had never wronged him would suffer the consequences of a deal collapsing entirely. He did not answer Olivia immediately, telling her only that he would think about it. And Olivia, recognizing she would get nothing more from him that afternoon, thanked him and returned to her car, driving back through the rain to deliver the news that the man Victoria had dismissed as unqualified was, in fact, the very architect the company's entire fortune depended upon. When Olivia returned to the office, she found Victoria still seated at her desk, staring blankly at a financial report that no longer meant what it once had. And she did not soften what she had to say. She told Victoria plainly that Ethan Carter was not simply a maintenance worker who had gotten lucky with a guess, but the original engineer behind the very pricing algorithm the company still used, a fact confirmed by patent records, engineering signatures, and source code annotations that all bore his name. Victoria's expression shifted slowly from disbelief to something closer to dread as she pulled up the archived files herself, scrolling through page after page of technical documentation, all of it undeniably tracing back to the man she had thrown out of her building that very morning. She sat in silence for a long time after Olivia left the room, staring at Ethan Carter's name printed across a decade-old patent filing, and something inside her, something she rarely allowed herself to examine too closely, cracked open just slightly. She had spent her entire career believing that intelligence could be measured by title, that competence wore a certain kind of clothing, that a uniform meant one thing and a corner office meant another, and now she understood, with an unwelcome clarity, that the man she had dismissed without a second glance understood her own company's core technology better than anyone currently on her payroll. It was not simply a mistake she had made. It was a mirror she had been forced, unwillingly, to look into. That evening, without informing her assistant, without the usual entourage that followed her everywhere, Victoria drove herself through the rain to the same small repair shop Olivia had visited earlier that day. She stepped inside quietly, her expensive coat soaked through at the shoulders, and found Ethan exactly where he had been hours before, still working, still unbothered by the storm outside, or the one now settling somewhere behind her eyes. He looked up, unsurprised to see her, and waited without speaking, letting her be the one to break the silence she had created that morning. Victoria told him, in a voice stripped of the sharp certainty she usually carried into every room, that she was sorry, that she had dismissed him without listening, mocked him in front of colleagues, and cost the company more than $1 billion because she had assumed a uniform meant a limited mind. It was, by her own admission, the first time in her career she had ever apologized to an employee, let alone one she had personally fired only hours earlier. Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, and when she finished, he did not immediately accept her apology. Instead, he asked her one simple question that seemed to hang in the air far longer than its words should have allowed. If the mistake that morning had belonged to someone else, someone wearing a suit instead of a uniform, would she have apologized just as quickly, or would she have quietly protected them the way people in her position usually protected each other? Victoria opened her mouth to answer immediately, the way she answered everything, and then stopped, because she realized, with an honesty that unsettled her, that she did not actually know the answer, and that uncertainty frightened her more than the collapsed deal ever had. The silence between them stretched long enough that the rain outside seemed to fill the entire room, and in that silence, something inside Victoria finally gave way completely, some rigid structure she had built around herself, over years of climbing past people she considered beneath her attention. She admitted, quietly, and without her usual polish, that she likely would not have reacted the same way, that titles had always mattered to her more than they should have, and that she was only now beginning to understand how much that blindness had cost the people around her. Not just financially, but personally. She told him, almost as an afterthought, that she had built her entire career on trusting numbers over people, and that until this week, she had never once considered how much that habit might have cost her, without her ever noticing. Ethan watched her for a long moment, something in his posture softening slightly, though he still did not offer forgiveness outright. He told her, quietly, that he was not owed an apology so much as she was owed the discomfort of sitting with what she had done, and that comfort had never once made anyone a better leader. Victoria nodded slowly at that, accepting the correction without argument, understanding that whatever came next between them would have to be earned rather than assumed. He told her that he was not interested in an apology meant only to save a deal, but he was willing to consider one meant to change something deeper. And Victoria, standing there dripping rain onto the concrete floor of a repair shop far from the polished glass towers she was used to, understood exactly what he meant. She did not push him further that night, sensing that whatever decision he made next needed to come entirely from him, without pressure, without the leverage her position usually afforded her. She thanked him for his time, told him the offer to help would remain open regardless of what he chose, and left quietly into the rain, feeling, for the first time in years, genuinely uncertain about how a conversation would end. Ethan did not sleep well that night, turning the question Victoria had unintentionally asked him over and over in his mind, not about the algorithm or the deal, but about the thousands of ordinary employees who had nothing to do with the boardroom decision that morning and everything to do with what happened if the company collapsed entirely. He thought about factory workers on assembly lines who would lose their positions long before any executive felt real financial pain, about single parents managing mortgages on salaries that left no room for sudden unemployment. And he realized that his anger toward Victoria, however justified, was not a reason to let strangers suffer for decisions they never made. He thought, too, about his own wife, and how she had once told him that the measure of a man was not how he treated the people who could help his career, but how he treated the people who could not. That memory settled the question more than anything else could have, and somewhere near dawn, still awake, he understood that walking away now would make him no different from the people who had once looked past him without seeing him at all. By morning, he had reached his decision, driving to the Helix building not as an employee, but as a man choosing, deliberately, to help. He did not ask for his old position back, and he did not ask for public recognition or a formal apology delivered before cameras or shareholders. He asked only for access to the original valuation model, a quiet room to work in, and enough time to correct not just the single-dollar error that had started the collapse, but a series of smaller structural weaknesses he had noticed within the algorithm over the years, weaknesses nobody at Helix had ever identified because nobody currently on staff fully understood the model's original architecture. Marcus Reed, still shaken from the events of the previous day, granted every request without hesitation, watching with something close to awe, as Ethan moved through code that had baffled the company's best engineers for years. Ethan worked for nearly 6 hours without pause, correcting the original discrepancy first, then tracing outward through every connected calculation, tightening logic that had drifted slightly out of alignment since the last major software update, refining thresholds that had never been properly recalibrated after the company's last expansion. He did not simply patch the immediate problem. He rebuilt confidence into a system that had quietly been eroding for longer than anyone realized, restoring the kind of precision that only its original creator could fully understand. When he finally submitted the corrected model for review, the automated risk engine used by Daniel Brooks's investment fund returned a single word where a red warning had appeared only a day before: verified. Daniel Brooks, reviewing the updated report from his office in New York, agreed to reopen discussions, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, as his own analysts confirmed the integrity of the revised valuation. Within 48 hours, a new signing ceremony was scheduled, quieter this time. without the champagne glasses or the celebratory atmosphere of the first attempt, but with a level of genuine trust that the original meeting had never actually earned. The deal that had collapsed in front of hundreds of investors was, against every expectation inside that building, alive again, resting on the same $1 correction that had destroyed it in the first place. When the papers were finally signed, there was no applause in the room, no triumphant speeches, only a quiet exhale from executives who understood exactly how close they had come to losing everything over a mistake smaller than the price of a cup of coffee. Victoria stood near the back of the room during the signing, deliberately avoiding the spotlight she usually sought, watching instead as Marcus Reed and Daniel Brooks exchanged signatures on documents that would never have existed without a man she had once told to fix his light bulb and disappear. She understood, standing there, that the deal being saved was not really the point anymore. In the days that followed, Victoria requested a private meeting with Ethan, this time in a modest conference room rather than the executive suite, and offered him the position of Chief Technology Officer, along with a compensation package larger than anything she had ever personally negotiated for herself. She told him the position came with significant equity, full authority over the company's technical direction, and a public acknowledgement of everything he had done to save the company from its own arrogance. Ethan listened carefully, considered the offer with the same quiet patience he brought to everything, and then declined it entirely. He explained that he had no interest in returning to the kind of life that had once consumed him so completely that he barely noticed the people around him falling apart, a life of titles and equity and endless meetings that left no room for the quiet, in ordinary existence he had rebuilt for himself after tragedy. He agreed instead to remain as an independent advisor, available when the company genuinely needed his expertise, but unwilling to trade his simplified life for a corner office ever again. Victoria did not argue with his decision, recognizing, perhaps for the first time, that not every valuable person could be measured by the position they were willing to accept. What changed most permanently at Helix Dynamics was not the org chart or the executive roster, but something quieter and far more difficult to build, a shift in how the entire company chose to listen. Victoria implemented a new policy, allowing any employee, regardless of title or department, to escalate concerns directly to leadership, without first passing through layers of management that had previously filtered out anything deemed beneath serious consideration. She sat in on early morning briefings with facilities staff, something she had never once done in her years as Chief Executive Officer. And she made a quiet, personal habit of asking every new employee what they had noticed that others might have missed. Marcus Reed, still shaken by how close the company had come to losing everything, quietly rewrote the finance department's review procedures so that every valuation model would be checked not only by software, but by at least one person outside the immediate team, someone whose only qualification was a willingness to ask uncomfortable questions. Daniel Brooks, for his part, mentioned the incident occasionally to other investors as a cautionary story, not about algorithms or nonlinear thresholds, but about the danger of assuming that expertise always wore the clothing you expected it to wear. Word of what had happened traveled slowly beyond the walls of Helix, reshaping, in small and quiet ways, how a handful of other companies chose to treat the people who kept their buildings running. Months later, on an ordinary afternoon with pale winter light filtering through the executive floor windows, Victoria walked through the same service corridor where she had once dismissed a maintenance worker without a second glance. She noticed a small metal bolt lying on the floor near an open panel, the kind of object anyone else might have stepped over without a thought. And she stopped, bent down, and picked it up carefully between her fingers. She turned it over once, studying its ordinary, unremarkable shape, and a small, genuine smile crossed her face as she remembered a sentence spoken to her months earlier by a man in a faded uniform she had almost refused to hear. "The smallest things," he had told her, "are often the only reason the whole machine does not fall apart." Victoria placed the bolt gently into her coat pocket, glanced once more down the quiet corridor where an entire company's fortune had once nearly collapsed over a single dollar, and walked on, carrying with her a lesson far heavier than any number that had ever appeared on her screen.